Amazon Aurora Serverless works? In order to understand how it works, let's look at the Aurora Serverless architecture. With Aurora Serverless, when creating a database endpoint, you do not need to specify the database instance class size. You just need to set the minimum and maximum capacity. Instead of directly connecting to the database resources, the database endpoint connects to a proxy fleet. Database client applications don't need to change to use the proxy fleet. The proxy fleet routes the workload to a fleet of resources that are automatically scaled. Aurora Serverless manages the connections automatically. Because of the proxy fleet, connections are continuous as Aurora Serverless scales the resources automatically based on the minimum and maximum capacity specifications. Scaling is rapid because it uses a pool of warm resources that are always ready to service requests. Storage and processing are separate, so you can scale down to zero processing and pay only for storage. Auto-scaling. Instead of provisioning and managing database servers, you specify Aurora capacity units, ACUs. Each ACU is a combination of processing and memory capacity. Database storage automatically scales from 10 GB to 64 TB, the same as storage in a standard Aurora DB cluster. You can specify the minimum and maximum ACU. The minimum Aurora capacity unit is the lowest ACU to which the DB cluster can scale down. The maximum Aurora capacity unit is the highest ACU to which the DB cluster can scale up. Scaling point. A scaling point is a point in time at which the database can safely initiate the scaling operation. When Aurora Serverless determines that the DB cluster should be scaled, it continues to try to find a scaling point to initiate the scaling operation. However, Aurora Serverless might not be able to find a scaling point when long-running queries or transactions are in progress, or when temporary tables or table locks are in use. You can see scaling events in the details for a DB cluster in the AWS Management Console. You can also monitor the current capacity allocated to the DB cluster by using the Serverless Database Capacity metric for Amazon Cloud Watch. During autoscaling, Aurora Serverless resets the engine uptime metric. The reset metric value doesn't indicate any issues with seamless scaling, and doesn't mean that any connections were dropped. The Aurora Serverless DB cluster capacity seamlessly scales up and down based on the load, that is the CPU utilization and number of connections, generated by your client application. When there are no connections for a 5-minute period, it scales to zero capacity. When capacity constraints are seen, for example, when greater than 70% CPU utilization or greater than 90% of max connections, Aurora Serverless scales up. It also scales up when it detects performance issues that can be resolved by scaling up. After scaling up, the cooldown period for scaling down is 15 minutes. After scaling down, the cooldown period for scaling down again is 310 seconds. There is no cooldown period for scaling up. Next, let's look at an auto-scaling example. Based on settings, Aurora Serverless automatically creates scaling rules. For example, when greater than 70% CPU utilization or greater than 90% of max connections, Aurora Serverless scales up. Aurora Serverless manages the warm pool of resources to minimize scaling time. It takes DB capacity from the warm pool. Next, it starts looking for a scaling point, a point in time at which the database can safely initiate the scaling operation. When the scaling point is found, Aurora Serverless adds new resources to the Aurora DB cluster. It uses a proxy fleet to switch active client connections to the new resources. At any specific time, you are only charged for the ACUs that are being actively used in your Aurora DB cluster. Automatic pause and resume for Aurora Serverless. After a given amount of time with no activity, you can choose to pause your Aurora Serverless DB cluster. You specify the amount of time with no activity before the DB cluster is paused. The default is 5 minutes. When the DB cluster is paused, no compute or memory activity occurs, and you are charged only for storage. You can also disable pausing the DB cluster. If a DB cluster is paused for more than 7 days, the DB cluster might be backed up with a snapshot. If database connections are requested, when an Aurora Serverless DB cluster is paused, the DB cluster automatically resumes and services the connection requests. Timeout action for capacity changes. When you change the capacity, Aurora Serverless tries to find a scaling point for the change. If Aurora Serverless can't find a scaling point, it times out. You can specify one of the following timeout actions to take. You can force the capacity change. This sets the capacity to the specified value as soon as possible. You can also roll back the capacity change, which means the capacity change is cancelled.